So what does the whole Milo Yiannopoulis pedophilia thing have to do with Islamophobia?
This is a word. This is a world premiere. This is a word.
Less than a week ago, Milo Yiannopoulis was being heralded by the right as the champion of freedom of speech. That was until he said the wrong thing. Less than 2 weeks ago, the right and pretty much everyone else was defending the right for Milo Yiannopoulis to stand on a stage at Berkeley and say pretty much anything that came to his mind. At least there weren't any questions about what the topic of his presentation was going to be. Less than 2 weeks ago, there was nothing that anyone could say that would warrant their being censored. Certainly nothing that would warrant a protest to stop them from saying it. Then suddenly it was insinuated that Milo Yiannopoulis might condone pedophilia, and then all bets were off. Suddenly there were pundits from the right denouncing Milo for what he said about pedophiles. He was disinvited from his CPAC engagement, and Simon & Schuster canceled his book deal. Now, what does this have to do with Islamophobia? First, I want to say that I do not in any way condone relationships between adults and children. I mean, maybe there's a fine line about a relationship between an 18-year-old and a 16-year-old, but certainly as far as I'm concerned, relationships between adults and adolescents are a no-go. Of course, not everyone agrees with me. We know that there have been instances in the United States where pedophilia has basically been sanctioned. For example, for years when it was being covered up in the Catholic Church. Lots of people knew what was going on between priests and the children of their parishioners, but for some reason people thought it was a better idea to keep that covered up. I also happen to know that there's been a tradition for years of European men and American men traveling to places like Morocco where they could engage freely in sex with underage boys. Again, something that you don't hear very much about in the media. Now, again, I'm gonna say, I don't condone in any way, consensual or otherwise, sexual relations between adults and adolescents. But, yes, there is a but. I don't think the very worst thing that can happen to a child is to have an adult touch them in an inappropriate way. Like having an adult murder a child. However, when it comes to the death of children all over the world in numbers that you would not believe, to the tune of about 21,000 children a day being killed by starvation, war, and other forms of violence, preventable diseases. These are all forms of violence that are visited on children every single day. And why? To provide us in the West with our comfortable lifestyles. What if I were to say 21,000 children a day fall victim to pedophiles? I have a sneaking suspicion that that would be more egregious to a lot of people than hearing about the fact that 21,000 children a day are dying from completely preventable causes. The difference being basically that those children are black and brown and kids that don't look like most Americans and most Westerners. And on some level, I think it comes down to racism and homophobia. When we think about pedophilia, the chances of the target being white are much greater than the chances of a white child dying of starvation, or from war, or from a preventable disease. And it doesn't matter if you're on the left or on the right, something that you see as potentially harming your own child is gonna mean a lot more to you than something that you think is gonna affect those kids over there, even though you yourself might be some way culpable for what's happening to those kids over there. And it's pretty hypocritical when we take a moral stance only when the immorality is somehow going to affect us. Which brings me to the topic of Islamophobia. We talk about the horrors of terrorism, specifically as it relates to Islamic extremists. You have social theorists like Sam Harris speaking out about how Islamophobia is the greatest threat to stability in the world today. Really? Islamic terrorists are the greatest threat to stability in the world today? Is there anyone who really believes that if all of the Islamic terrorists were to drop dead tomorrow, that we would have stability in the world today? I'm always shocked when I hear people talking about Islam and how violent that religion is and how violent those people are, making the grossest generalizations, as if the greatest threat to democracy was Islam, as if Muslims were somehow the most violent people on the planet. I mean, has anybody been keeping track of what's been happening in the world since 1492? Europe has kind of been on a campaign of terror for the last 500 plus years. Western forces have blazed a violent trail across every continent on the planet for 500 plus years. Read any history book. I'm talking about Africa, the Middle East, Asia, the Caribbean, Australia. There isn't a single continent on the planet where Europeans have not waged some campaign of violence for centuries. Yet Islam is responsible for the destabilization of the planet. When you talk about those 21,000 children that die every day in the world from preventable causes, we did that. When you talk about the hundreds of millions who will die all over the world in third world countries, we did that. And if you want to talk about specific acts of terrorism, the United States is responsible for probably the worst 2 acts of terrorism that the world has ever known. Remember when we dropped those 2 H bombs on Japan? And now we have an entire planet in jeopardy. We did that. And what about our own homegrown terrorism? The Southern Poverty Law Center has been keeping track of acts of terrorism in the United States by our own homegrown terrorists since the Oklahoma bombing in the 90s. Since then, there have been 125 acts or attempted acts of terrorism in the US by our own homegrown terrorists. Most, if not all, of these terrorists were Christian. Most, if not all, of these terrorists were white. Go read about the number of mosques that have been burned or threatened just in recent months. Since Donald Trump began his campaign of terror, go look at the number of synagogues and Jewish community centers that have received bomb threats. So it doesn't really matter if we're talking about pedophilia or Islamophobia or animal advocacy. It all boils down to one thing: whose lives matter and whose don't. I don't know, what do you think? Do you think I'm exaggerating, or might the US and the rest of Western society look at their own terrorism problem before painting such a harsh picture of others? That's it for this video. Like it if you like it, share, comment, subscribe. This is Reg signing off. Love yourself. Peace.